But the heart of Marxism, in my view, and I think I could speak for Dr. Lindsay, but have him on and let him, give his interpretation, is that Marxism is a theology. It's not an economic theory. If you read the economic and philosophic manuscripts, I think Marx is very clear. He says human beings are creative and we're social. Now, I'm a pretty plain guy. I'm not an academic. I have no special training. I still don't consider myself a writer. So I'm going to put this in plain terms. When Marx says human beings are creative, he means we see something in the world like a stick, and we've got a vision in our head of what we want to turn that stick into. We've got a vision in our head of what we want the world to look like. So maybe I want to make a spear. I grab a sharp rock, I start cutting away at the stick, I whittle it away, I slowly match what's in my head to the physical reality of my world. That's what Marx meant by humans have a creative nature. And in that, the deeper meaning of that is that when we look into the world, we see ourselves reflecting back at us. We see our creativity, our subjective thoughts, the vision of my spear objectified in the real world. And what he said is we look out into the world we're humanizing with our creativity, and it reflects back our human nature. And we see ourselves as gods, essentially, is what it comes down to. Marx said our species being is also social. That's our spiritual species property, to use his own terms. And what he means by that is we're not born in the world alone. We're not born in a vacuum. He said the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, meaning we're born into a world that's already been humanized. We're born into a world where other people have used their creative potential to transform the world into their vision. So in a sense, our conscious... The burden
of what has been.
Right. Yes, exactly. And do a little hand gesture. And
right. And a cackle, an evil cackle that curls your spine.
Right. And what
freezes the blood of small children.
And what Marx said is because we've got this creative potential to transform our world into our own vision, and we're a social creature, what those things differentiate us from the animals. And because we can do those things, we make history. Meaning when I'm born into a world others have worked on. They've already transformed nature. If I'm born in a primitive tribe, I'm not going to be going and creating a spacefaring civilization. So the history of the people that have come before me preloads my consciousness, and that makes history. And then the people in my present tribe, whatever you want, your city, those of us attempting to send rockets to Mars, we then socialize the next generation into the world. And Marx's whole theology is the idea that we can arrest this process of history. We can direct it. It's not something that just has to happen. And it's incumbent on those who are oppressed to arrest it, because the group in power who's created the society with capitalism, it would be the bourgeoisie and their private property and the laws, rules, and regulations that have been built up to solidify their social status and their domination. They're not going to overthrow history and direct history in the direction we want it, because they're pretty set. They're enjoying their lives. They're happy. So it's incumbent on the oppressed to become conscious of this fact that we can arrest history and we can direct it. And that's Marx's program, the arresting of history through conflict to drive it to an ultimate endpoint, one where we look out in the world and it reflects our humanity back onto us. Marx said, when we look into the world and we're one with nature and nature is one with us. I think his precise words to describe it in almost biblical terms was, he said that when man looks out and he revolves around himself as his own true son. I mean, it doesn't get any more theological than that. So I think that's the heart of it, and everything derives from that. It doesn't make sense that it's an economic theory. It never has. That's why over 100 million people died starving to death in the dark. That's why it doesn't work, because he mapped his economics on top of a theology to sell it, is my opinion.
Okay. So let's delve into the theological side for a moment, and then we'll return to the postmodern element. Okay, so there's two things you laid out as far as I'm understanding what you're saying. And the first is, well, some support for your argument that this is a theological movement is that, well, it is a post-religious movement, and it's also something that Nietzsche predicted when he discussed the death of God. He said in The Will to Power that the human race would run an experiment in the 20th century that would likely doom millions of people to investigate the validity of a resentment-predicated communism, and that if we learned the proper lesson from that, then perhaps the sacrifice of lives would have proved valuable and necessary. Now, that's a hell of a harsh thing to say, but it's also quite the remarkable prediction. And of course, Dostoevsky saw the same things coming, especially in his book Demons, which is as accurate a prodroma to the Gulag Archipelago as you could possibly hope for. Okay, so let's look at this theologically. Because I think it is a theology. It's a post-Christian theology. No, it's an anti-Christian theology. And so part of the reason it's anti-Christian is because Marx's fundamental presupposition is that the God of power does and should rule. Right? So that's quite a claim. And I think actually you can understand the attractiveness of that claim, especially on the economic side, because the idea that there is a small minority of people who hold comparative power in any human social hierarchy is true in some manner. It's particularly true if the society is corrupt. And it is also the case that even the most benevolent of social organizations are corrupted to some degree by power. And so power is a major league god, you might say. And it's very attractive intellectually, especially if you're a rather rigid reductionist and you don't like to think in a sophisticated manner, is to reduce everything to power, as Foucault did, power and sexuality in Foucault's case. And you can make a credible case for that. You can make a credible case that your relationship with yourself is one of power, and your relationship with your wife, and your relationship with your children, and your so-called friends, and every economic relationship. It all boils down to power, and only the naive think differently. And so the world's a war of power. And that's not only an anti-Christian doctrine in the most fundamental way, it's almost literally a satanic doctrine, because in the Gospels, for example, Christ is literally tempted by the Satan who offers him power as an alternative to the proper principle of sovereignty. Okay, so that's the first thing, is Marxism is a theology of power. All right. The next thing is that you pointed out was that it's a dialectic of oppressed versus oppressor. And so that's also interesting theologically, because the story of Cain and Abel is an oppressor versus oppressed theology. And the spirit of Cain is the spirit of the resentful oppressed who rebels against the upward striving individual who makes the proper sacrifices, destroys him, and rebels against God pridefully and deceitfully. Right, so that's another theological element. Now, the Marxists would say, well, religion, Christianity is the opiate of the masses, and perhaps Cain, under the sway of the Lucifer, who's regarded as an admirable rebel by the Marxists, including Marx, is the upholder of the proper revolutionary spirit. But it's certainly the case that the notion that existence itself, history itself, all relationships are a battleground of power between the oppressor and the oppressed is central to Marxism as far as I'm concerned. It's not a Marxist idea in and of itself, but it's central to Marxism. And it's also a pretty damn saleable idea, especially if your culture is corrupted by power and you have your self-serving reasons for regarding yourself as victimized and oppressed. That was what Nietzsche objected to with regards to the philosophy of resentment. And Marxism is the philosophy of resentment writ large. And the problem with that is that there's a lot of things in life to be resentful about. Right? So it's easy to sell. It's a doctrine that suits the pathologically immature. And so, okay, so is there anything in my characterization of Marxism as a theology that's at odds with the manner in which you're construing it?
No, I don't think so. And a point to add is not only is it an easy sell, but it's a really easy sell to children, which is the relevant area where I'm most concerned. You know, adults can be set in their ways. And of course, you're going to have those with psychopathologies that really find a lot of value in resentment and how I conceive of it, a religion that answers all of their questions about why they are where they are in life and why things, what their purpose should be and why they should be so resentful and they should be justified in being resentful. I get that, but with children, it's a super, super easy sell. It's dividing the world into black and white, and it's easy to replicate, very easy to replicate. You know, the structure of classical, what's now called vulgar Marxism, looks something like this. You have some people who decide to create a society in the classic vulgar sense and give themselves a form of private property. They create the idea of private property and build institutions around that to solidify it. And they give it to themselves. And they justify this private property going to themselves in an ideology called capitalism that explains to everyone that this is common sense, neutral, and fair. Things have always been this way. They're justified in having what they have. You're justified in your low position on the totem pole as a worker. And this is how things are going to be. And it's incumbent on those workers to wake up to the fact that the call of history has chosen them to move the dialectic forward, to take historical materialism to the next stage of history. You can map that, and part of the point of the book, The Queering of the American Child, is precisely this. You can map that in a lot of different domains. It's amazing it took them this long to do it. I mean, with critical race theory, you've got white people who created a society they've invented and given themselves a socio-cultural private property called whiteness. Cheryl Harris, in her paper, it was the late 80s or early 90s, literally said whiteness as property was the title of the paper. And right in there, she says it's akin to a bourgeois private property. They give it to themselves. They create an ideology of white supremacy that says this is neutral, common sense, and fair. This is how things have always been. And it's incumbent on the oppressed, which in this particular stance would be people who happen to be black or people of color, anyone who's non-white, to rise up and develop instead of a class consciousness, it's been a long day, an anti-racist consciousness, and to create things like what Ibram X. Kendi proposed with the Department of Anti-Racism that supersedes all laws and jurisdictions in the United States, so we can force this on everyone. And we're going to use equity, which is socialism, to redistribute access to resources. And we're going to sum everything up within the sentence abolition of whiteness rather than abolition of private property as human self-estrangement. You can map that exact structure onto queer theory, which is some people in society created a form of socio-cultural private property called normalcy, or being normal, and they gave it to themselves. And they use that to stratify society between those who have access to normalcy and all of the attendant privileges and those who don't. They hide it in an ideology of cis heteronormativity that explains to everyone that this is neutral, common sense, and fair, the way things should be. It's good to be normal. And it's incumbent on, and I think this requires a definition. I can go into it if you want, but it's incumbent on those who are queer. And this is not a statement of essential identity. I can explain precisely what I mean. It does not mean gay. It does not mean lesbian. It's antithetical to a person happening to be gay or lesbian. But it's incumbent on them to rise up and abolish normalcy as private property. It's all the same. It's the same engine under the car, Jordan. You know, it's just painted differently. It's just a different flavor.
Okay,